Welcome to Negotiation and Conflict Resolution, Week 1, Introduction Lecture Number 2. The construction industry has a long history of using conflict resolution in its various forms to resolve construction disputes. The roots go back to ancient Greece and Rome. Many of you know the story of King Solomon. Two women were fighting over who was the true mother of a child. The king's decision, after hearing their arguments, was to cut the baby in half. Now pause here for a minute because the term split the baby is very important in the study and practice of arbitration, and we'll be covering that in more detail when we get to the arbitration segment of this program. But going back to the ancient dispute, the mothers decided that this decision of the king was not acceptable, but it did force them to come up with their own solution. And again, that concept has followed into modern negotiation strategy. Sometimes the recommendation of a third party forces the parties who have the problem to go back and reconsider and see if there's another option that maybe didn't seem as good before, but in the face of an unpleasant option, some other solutions come up which are now more acceptable. The construction industry was also part of the Merchants' Forum during these times, and in those days, trusted community members would help resolve disputes among vendors and buyers and sellers, and also the suppliers and the contractors within the construction industry. The Merchants' Forum led to the first code of arbitration in the English system, which dates back to the 17th century. The original arbitrator, whether it was in Rome or in England, was chosen for these three reasons. It was someone who was known in the community. This was not a stranger coming in and telling the locals what to do. This was someone who was known to the people who were having the dispute, as well as their neighbors and their business associates. Also, the person knows the business. They know how to build a building or how to conduct a sale properly within a certain industry. And finally, the person has a reliable reputation for being trustworthy and honest. You could take a dispute to this person and get an answer. You may not be happy with the answer, but you know that the person will have listened and paid attention and applied his knowledge appropriately. And keep in mind that this arbitrator, being a member of the community, is not going to make decisions rashly or in favor of one or the other in order to curry favor. And that went a long way toward using someone within the community, within the business arena, who was known to be reliable and trustworthy to be the decision maker. Today's third-party dispute resolvers are basically chosen for the same reason. They're someone known in the community, or at least known to the parties in the dispute through other contacts. They know the business and they have a solid reputation, which the dispute resolver does not want to have damaged. Now we're going to pause here for some terminology. Neutrals is a broad umbrella term that covers any third party who assists disputing parties in resolving their problem. The parties usually voluntarily select the neutral, but the neutral could be appointed by a court or some other administrative body. There are two other criteria of a neutral. The person or group of people should be skilled in the subject area and skilled in the particular conflict resolution process. Now, these are certainly preferred in most instances, but not necessarily required. And as we study the different forms of conflict resolution and the forums which oversee these dispute resolution processes, you'll see that sometimes these criteria are required and sometimes they're not, but this all goes back to the voluntary nature of most forms of dispute resolution, that the parties have control over many things, including these factors. The parties can insist that the neutral be skilled in the subject matter and skilled in the particular type of process. It's not enough for an arbitrator to suddenly switch hats and be a mediator or to be a fact finder. At this point in the evolution of the construction resolution process, there are enough people out there with the experience that as you are selecting neutrals, you should look for people with these criteria. Now, a final note on that, if it is a court or some other body appointing the neutral, the parties do lose a little bit of control, but they should make it clear to the appointing body that those skills are important to them. Now, in the case of a panel of neutrals, that might be 3 arbitrators, that might be 3 members of a dispute review board. Keep in mind that the parties may or may not be affiliated with one or other of the parties. There's a term called party-appointed arbitrators. We will cover in more detail in the arbitration section. In dispute review boards, often the contractor selects one of the board members, the owner selects the other, and those two get together and select the third. Now, with these party-affiliated neutrals, once they are appointed, they might still be expected to perform impartially, or they might be expected to perform with the bias toward the party who's appointing them. Again, as we get into the specific types of dispute resolution where 3-member panels are the decision makers or the facilitators, this concept of whether or not they are affiliated and whether or not they are affiliated but independent is an important point we will cover in more detail. Now, why does the construction industry like conflict resolution and its many forms? Well, the size of the industry, simply the sheer volume of how many things are built, obviously is going to result in a lot of disputes, and they can't all reasonably be handled by a court. Construction is also technically complex, and because it's technically complex, the body of law surrounding it, the statutes and the court decisions, are equally complex. Parties to construction disputes, or parties to construction projects as well, have ongoing relationships. And finally, the reputation of an owner or a contractor or a design professional is very important to receiving ongoing work. All of these factors contribute to why conflict resolution is an important part of the construction industry. As we examine each of these different processes, you'll see that the informal forums provide more opportunity and less of a backlog, so disputes can be resolved promptly. As we discussed a moment ago, industry experts as neutrals are often what you find in most types of construction conflict resolution. Industry neutrals are not confused by complex presentations put on by expert witnesses, and keep in mind that one of the reasons that construction avoids the courts is because a jury can be very impressed without fully understanding a fancy presentation by an expert witness. So there are many reasons we'll get into a little bit more later why courts will often push construction disputes that end up on the docket out to dispute resolution, but there are many reasons coming from within the industry why ADR and different forms of conflict resolution are more amenable to resolving construction disputes, and this concept of the industry neutral is one of the most important ones. Also, conflict resolution processes are flexible, and the parties have much more say in tailoring the process to meet their needs, as well as meet the specific facts of the dispute. And finally, most forms of construction ADR are private, so there aren't the risks you get in a court where you have a public dispute. In most private arbitration, reputations can be preserved, and people don't make assumptions that simply because someone has a dispute, there must be something wrong with how that organization conducts its business. So the diversity of the disputes and the diversity of the parties in the disputes creates a diversity of conflict resolution processes in the construction industry. Construction industry leads the way in creating different types of dispute resolution procedures. You will often see many of these procedures used in other industries, but the construction industry really focuses on fine-tuning them and collecting data to make these procedures better and better for future generations of construction disputes and their resolvers. This slide shows the list of conflict resolution procedures set up in the dispute resolution triangle. You also may hear the term dispute resolution spectrum or continuum. There are many, many variations of this. In a later discussion, we'll show it on a set of staircases. But this is one of my favorite ways to show the different types of dispute resolution as they're aligned by how much party control and usually lower cost and faster resolution. Those are the procedures over there in the green section. Structured negotiation, partnering, facilitation, and most of those procedures don't include a third party. As you start moving into the yellow, you start having more involvement of a third party. Conciliation, early neutral resolution, and the rest, you're bringing in those neutrals to help resolve the dispute, but it's still a process. Any of those things there in the yellow section, there's still a lot of party control, and many of these procedures can be done earlier on when the dispute arises. As you get into the red zone, that's when the dispute resolver, the arbitrator, or the judge, or the jury has a lot more control over the outcome. They're usually much more formal procedures, they take more time, and they cost more money. So please keep this continuum or triangle handy. It is very important to the resolution of construction disputes. Within this week's materials, there are additional pieces of information which further define these specific procedures. Please take some time and go through those carefully, but keep in mind where each of these sits on this dispute resolution continuum. And with that, we will conclude this overview of construction dispute resolution processes and the history of those processes within the construction industry, and move on to the beginning of negotiation.